Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander and welcome to the Great War. Throughout the summer of 1920, British authorities in Ireland were facing a crisis. Armed resistance against British rule on the island was going into its fourth year, police morale was at an all-time low, IRA attacks were increasing, and large areas of the island were essentially outside of British control. By early fall, however, it seemed that the British had at least partially been able to improve their situation. The arrival of the new Auxiliary Division, which was made up of former army officers, seemed to have given them the upper hand over the IRA, even though their reprisals against civilians did cause growing resentment. But the IRA was not defeated, and in fact, they were in the midst of making ambitious plans for future operations against the British. In this episode, we'll take a look at two critical moments in the Anglo-Irish War that took place exactly 100 years ago: Bloody Sunday and the Killmichael Ambush. In September and October 1920, it seemed to many observers that the IRA was weakening, and morale amongst their brigades was indeed low. They did have several tactically successful ambushes against British police, but these had brought little in the way of strategic or political change. In fact, at this stage, there were more British troops and police in Ireland than ever before, and the province of Ulster was de facto separated from the rest of the island. Some in the IRA even wanted to abandon their policy of guerrilla warfare in favor of open conflict with the British, even though they lacked the arms and heavy weapons to make a go of it. The General Headquarters refused the idea, but tensions remained. On the British side, Prime Minister David Lloyd George was also under pressure. He was facing a series of massive strikes and protests in England, and therefore was even more motivated to end the violence in Ireland by finding a political solution. So he put out the first feelers of peace towards the IRA, but for the moment, they brought no results. Lloyd George was also having problems with his own military, especially the British commander in Ireland, General Neville Macready. Macready didn't like the Irish, but he also disagreed with the practice of extrajudicial police reprisals against civilians, which Lloyd George had essentially allowed. Instead, Macready wanted to introduce martial law, which was a drastic step, but which would also give a legal basis for British actions and repression of the uprising. But in the fall of 1920, it seemed to the British that the situation was under control, so martial law would not become necessary. So the British were certainly under pressure in Ireland, but they also thought that they were winning the war. But the IRA had not gone away, and was about to mobilize and retake the initiative, thanks in large part to the intelligence work of Michael Collins. Now, Collins had been active for years in the revolutionary movement and had even participated in the Easter Rising back in 1916. In 1919, he became Minister of Finance in the self-proclaimed Irish Parliament, and soon after that, he became Minister for Home Affairs and Director of Intelligence. He soon became the most significant figure in the IRA, thanks to his skill as an organizer and as an intelligence operative. And this, even though most people did not even know what he looked like, since there were very few photos of him, even though he hid in plain sight in the cafes and bars of Dublin. The British even put a £10,000 bounty on his head, even though they'd already captured and released him several times without recognizing who he was. He attained a sort of mythical status in Ireland, and even Lloyd George had to give him some praise. The tenacity of the IRA is extraordinary. Where was Michael Collins during the Great War? He would have been worth a dozen brass hats. Now, Collins understood that intelligence would be key to the IRA's eventual success, and he installed an intelligence section in each of his IRA brigades. But he knew that Dublin would be the center of the intelligence war, and so there he helped to build up an intelligence network of IRA informers who were working within the British administration and even the police. For example, IRA presence in the postal service was so pervasive that eventually the British quit using it for official purposes altogether. The information that the IRA gained through these networks often included the private addresses of significant British figures in Ireland, which they could then use to plan targeted assassinations. Now, most of these assassinations were carried out by a group known as the Squad, sometimes called the 12 Apostles. Between January 1919 and October 1920, the Squad claimed to have assassinated 100 police officers, including several important members of the British intelligence network. For the most part, it seemed that British intelligence was playing catch-up, even though Britain was considered to have one of the world's best intelligence services as the Great War came to an end. But in Ireland, they consistently underestimated the strength and scope of the Republican movement and could not even identify most of its top leaders. In October, the British services suffered a humiliation when they arrested but then released the leaders of the Cork IRA brigade without having recognized them. One of the problems with British intelligence is that there were several different agencies who often had difficulty coordinating their work together. There was the Special Crimes section of the RIC, there was the Detective Division of the Dublin Police, as well as others. But the main problem for the British was their weakness in human intelligence, as IRA agent Florence O'Donoghue recalled. One thing the British lacked, which the IRA had in generous measure, was the cooperation of the people, and without it, they were blind and impotent. With relatively fewer people willing to help them, the British had to rely on a network of paid informants. But this network could be infiltrated by the IRA and could also be intimidated by the IRA, and many people knew that informing for the Crown was liable to cost them their lives. Now, all this doesn't mean that the British had no successes whatsoever, and as time went on, Collins began to worry about British infiltration of IRA networks. In fact, in mid-November 1920, the British were able to obtain a case of documents that allowed them to identify 200 IRA men's names, and several operatives close to Collins were arrested and brought in for interrogation. So although the IRA had built a successful intelligence network under Michael Collins, it now seemed that the net might be tightening around them. So they decided that a bold move was required to show the British that the IRA was not going anywhere. On November 21st, Collins made his move, and Bloody Sunday began. The IRA operation that was launched on Bloody Sunday was designed to deliver a knockout blow to British intelligence in Dublin. The plan was to assassinate 12 British agents who were members of the so-called Cairo Gang and who all lived outside of the protective police barracks in the city, in the area commonly referred to as No Man's Land. The IRA plan was indeed risky. The size of the operation meant that the Squad, which was responsible for carrying out the operations, would have to bring in new and untested men, and they could not be sure that they were trustworthy. But there was also criticism from within the IRA, not based on the risk, but based on the nature of the operation. IRA agent Todd Andrews recalled his opposition to the Squad's methods. Killing a man in cold blood was alien to our ideas of how war should be conducted. But despite these objections, the plan went ahead, and on the morning of the 21st, the Squad and other IRA agents involved formed 8 eight-man teams to carry out the operation. Unarmed scouts watched the target addresses to make sure that the coast was clear. Now, since it was Sunday, the IRA expected that most of the targets would still be in their beds or at least be at home, and at some of the target addresses, household servants allowed the IRA entrance into the homes. The operation began at 9 a.m., and historian Charles Townsend described one of the actions in Pembroke Street. The caretaker was shaking out the doormats when the 8 attackers walked up the steps at 9. So the front door was fortuitously open. In the hall, they split into 2 groups of 4 to go up the 2 thickly carpeted staircases. And on the landing, Charlie Dalton's group split again into 2 to enter the 2 bedrooms simultaneously. They identified the men they wanted, who each had a revolver in his hand, but both were shot before they could use them. At another location, a police patrol stumbled onto the attack while it was happening, and 2 auxiliary policemen were killed. In fact, these were the first 2 auxiliary fatalities of the entire war. Some of the targets at various locations managed to escape, and one was even able to wound 2 IRA attackers before getting away. By the end of the operation, 14 men had been killed, even though it's likely that the original IRA kill list was even longer. But the end of the IRA assassination operation did not mark the end of Bloody Sunday. The British retaliation came that afternoon, when auxiliaries and police surrounded a crowd that had been watching a Gaelic football match at Croke Park. Now, they said that they wanted to search the crowd for potential IRA infiltrators, but before they could do so, shooting broke out. It has not been confirmed conclusively that the shooting came from the crowd against the police, as the police later claimed. Over the next 3 minutes, British police fired more than 270 rounds into the crowd, killing 14 civilians, including 3 children. A further 60 people were wounded by gunshots or by the crush caused by the ensuing panic. That evening, British authorities at Dublin Castle executed 3 men, including high-ranking IRA members Dick McKee and Padraig Clancy. Now officially, the British claimed that the 2 were shot while trying to escape, but by 1920, this had become a euphemism in Ireland for execution. The events of Bloody Sunday sent a shockwave through Ireland, through Britain, and internationally as well. Up until now, Dublin had mostly been spared the violence of the War of Independence, but this time it had played host to the bloodiest day of the conflict, and the impact was felt immediately. The IRA wanted to present Bloody Sunday to the public as a victory. They'd struck back at an arrogant British enemy and also saved their own position in the process. And publicly, Michael Collins agreed. My one intention was the destruction of the undesirables who continued to make miserable the lives of ordinary, decent citizens. I have proof enough to assure myself of the atrocities which this gang of spies and informers have committed. If I had a second motive, it was not more than a feeling such as I would have for a dangerous reptile. By their destruction, the very air is made sweeter. For myself, my conscience is clear. They have destroyed without trial. I have paid them back in their own coin. Privately, though, Collins did express some concerns. He had not expected the executions of McKee and Clancy at Dublin Castle, and the reprisal against the civilians at Croke Park had been particularly harsh. Some historians have also questioned the official narrative of an IRA success. No original target list has survived, so it's hard to judge how successful the attack actually was. Up to half of the intended targets may have escaped, and the identities of those who were killed are up for a bit of debate as well. It does seem likely that many of them were in fact British intelligence operatives, but some of them may have been regular Dublin policemen who had run afoul of the Dublin IRA brigade. In Britain, the attacks shocked the public and there were calls for martial law. But Prime Minister Lloyd George instead appealed for calm, because behind the scenes he just started secret peace negotiations with Sinn Féin and was worried that Bloody Sunday would derail the talks. But just a week later, another bloody day in the war would put the prospect of peace into even further doubt. In County Cork, which was one of the worst hit areas by the violence in the war, the 3rd West Cork IRA Brigade was also planning an attack of its own. This group was led by Great War veteran Tom Barry and had been having a lot of trouble with aggressive and well-organized patrols by the local auxiliary policemen. These patrols also upset the local population, who accused the Auxiliaries of ransacking their homes and harassing them. But in spite of their local successes, the auxiliary detachments in Cork had begun to get complacent. As weather began to get worse with the approach of winter, they began to take the shortest and therefore most predictable routes back to base at the end of their patrols, as one policeman recalled. Winter is now coming on, and our patrols are no longer looked forward to. Indeed, they are becoming most unpleasant. We'd only open cars, and it rained nearly all the time. This discomfort, I think, may have been responsible for our disinclination to deviate from known roads. All this was not lost on the other side. There was always careless talk in the town, and it was easy for them to find out which section would be patrolling on any day, some days ahead, and make any plans that they saw fit. The IRA planned an ambush along a stretch of road just south of Killmichael, which featured an S-shaped bend flanked by a bog and low hills. This combination meant that the IRA would have cover from the hills and that the police would have nowhere to run in the bog. Barry planned for a typical patrol of 2 lorries. And on the morning of November 28th, Barry divided his forces for maximum effect. He and 3 others set up behind a low wall, and another group of IRA volunteers hid on the nearest hill. Together, these 2 groups would ambush the first lorry. Another IRA section occupied a hill a bit further back to attack the second lorry, and the final section split up between some rocks on the south side of the road and a reserve position further to the west. There were also unarmed scouts at either end of the road to keep a lookout. That afternoon, the first of the 2 police lorries carrying the auxiliaries appeared on the road, just as the IRA had expected. As planned, Barry stepped out in front of the vehicle and hailed it. As it slowed down, Barry then threw a grenade into the open top of the truck and ran for cover as the other volunteers opened fire. The driver and patrol commander were likely killed by the blast, and the truck came to a stop. The remaining auxiliaries jumped out and tried to get to the high ground off of the road, but most were cut down by rifle fire. The IRA volunteers then closed in and finished off the rest with bayonets and pistols. In just a few minutes, all 9 auxiliaries were dead. Shortly afterwards, the second lorry turned the corner and came under fire. The driver tried to reverse, but then got stuck. But the element of surprise had been lost, and so the policemen were able to get off of the truck and return fire. At this point, Barry's group then moved down the road to join in the fight. It was now that the so-called false surrender is alleged to have taken place. Some IRA men said that they heard the auxiliaries calling out that they wanted to surrender. Barry blew a whistle to cease fire, and some of the IRA men got up in order to make the police prisoner. Now, according to the IRA, at this point, several of the police officers drew their pistols and opened fire on the IRA volunteers, which killed 2 and wounded 1. One of the IRA fighters, Jack Hennessy, recalled the event. "We heard 3 blasts of the OC's whistle. I heard the 3 blasts and got up from my position, shouting 'hands up.' At the same time, one of the Auxies, about 5 yards from me, drew his revolver. He had thrown down his rifle. I pulled on him and shot him dead. I got back to cover where I remained for a few minutes, firing at live and dead Auxies on the road. The column OC sounded his whistle again. Nearly all of the Auxies had been wiped out." Now, the false surrender has become one of the most controversial aspects of the war, and the evidence is indeed contradictory. Tom Barry did not mention it in his post-battle report, but he did mention it later in his 1949 memoir. In that first report, he actually says that the IRA casualties took place earlier during the ambush and makes no mention of a fake surrender. On the other hand, the Auxiliary Division commander, Frank Crozier, did seem to think that a confused surrender had taken place at the time. One possibility that's been floated is that the auxiliaries did try to surrender, but in the fog of battle did not realize that their surrender was being accepted, and they might have interpreted Barry's whistle and advance down the road as a final assault on their position. It's also possible that some of the auxiliaries wanted or tried to surrender, but not all. And some others have even argued that the auxiliaries did in fact surrender, but were then executed by the IRA afterwards. Frederick Ford, who was the only policeman to survive the attack, gave his version of the events to a newspaper. "I suddenly heard a whistle blown loudly and a cry to cease fire. Then a large number of the attackers from both sides rushed into the road, shouting in the foulest language. These men proceeded to handle us all very roughly, not accepting even those who were by this time dead. After knocking us about, they called on us all to stand up and hold our hands up. After about 2 minutes, 2 of the party were able to stagger to their feet and were immediately shot down again at very close range by the Shinners." The debate about the false surrender still remains unresolved 100 years later. What is clear is that 45 minutes after the ambush began, 16 of the 18 auxiliaries lay dead. Frederick Ford survived a gunshot wound to the head, and Cecil Guthrie, who was the driver of the second lorry, managed to escape the scene but was later captured and executed by the IRA. So just a week after Bloody Sunday, the IRA had launched another major attack which had a big impact back in Great Britain. The seemingly invincible Auxiliary Division had suffered its first and most significant defeat of the war, and this action was discussed not as a criminal act, as in the case of previous IRA attacks, but as a military assault. The sophistication of the Killmichael Ambush and the psychological shock that it caused in Britain finally persuaded the government to declare martial law in several Irish counties. But Lloyd George wanted to avoid imposing martial law in Dublin because the police force there was not under military control. The British proclamation included this warning to the population: "Note well that a state of armed insurrection exists, that any person taking part therein, or harboring any person who has taken part therein, or procuring, inviting, aiding, or abetting any person to take part therein, is guilty of levying war against His Majesty the King, and is liable on conviction by a military court to suffer death." Following the proclamation of martial law, the IRA once again ambushed the police, this time in Cork City, killing 1 and wounding 11. In retaliation, Black and Tans, British troops, and auxiliaries set fire to the city centre. Much of the city's core was destroyed, including the City Hall and Carnegie Library, and both shops and homes were looted. The burning of Cork brought international condemnation and embarrassment for Great Britain. In fact, a British government report into the incident was not published because it was deemed disastrous for British policy. Residents of Cork received financial compensation for the attack, but for some of the auxiliaries, the reprisal was seen as payback for the previous 2 ambushes, and some were even seen wearing a burnt piece of cork on their caps to mark the event. The British authorities now decided that they had to limit or at least channel the violence of their forces in other ways. So they introduced an officially sanctioned policy of reprisals. It was hoped that these would take place under stricter discipline, and they would allow the police to vent their frustrations against the enemy without the scenes of random destruction that had been so damaging to Britain in Cork. The first government-approved reprisal took place in Middleton in January 1921. So as 1920 came to an end, British hopes for the future that had seemed so positive in the fall now looked grim, and Britain had suffered international humiliation. The IRA, on the other hand, had revived itself, and now the Irish War of Independence would enter a new and equally deadly phase. So now that we've caught up on the messy and complex events in Ireland in late 1920, I want to switch topics and talk to you a little bit about the messy and complex situation for history creators like us here on YouTube. Our 18-part, 5-hour-long documentary series about the Battle of Berlin wouldn't be allowed on YouTube because it shows a part of our history that's not, how shall we say, advertising friendly. So together with other creator friends of ours, we teamed up to have a platform where creators don't have to worry about demonetization or YouTube's infamous algorithm, and where the subscribers are directly supporting the creators that they watch. The content is ad-free. For example, the Nebula version of this video doesn't feature this very ad that you are watching right now. We want to thank Mark Newton for his help with this episode. And as usual, you can find all the sources we used for this episode in the video description below. If you want to support our channel, you can subscribe here on YouTube, and you can also support us on Patreon, and the link for that is in the description as well. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1920, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel that is winning the intelligence war.